In the summer of 1969, the world watched in disbelief as two Central American nations, El Salvador and Honduras, descended into open warfare. It wasn't a struggle over oil, territory, or ideology. It started with a soccer game. But beneath the roar of the crowd and the flash of goals, decades of resentment, injustice, and desperation had already built a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on a humid June night when a World Cup qualifying match lit the fuse of a real war. To understand how football turned into bloodshed, we must first go back to the root of the tension. Honduras and El Salvador, though neighbors, were divided by land, class, and opportunity. El Salvador, the smaller of the two, was bursting at the seams. Its population was approaching 4 million, but its fertile land was concentrated in the hands of a few elite families. Most Salvadorans lived in crushing poverty, unable to own the land they worked on. Across the border, Honduras had more land but fewer people. To many impoverished Salvadorans, it seemed like an open door, a chance to start over. By the mid-20th century, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had crossed into Honduras, often settling illegally. For years, they worked the soil, raised families, and blended into Honduran life. But landowners in Honduras began to push back, claiming Salvadoran migrants were taking too much. Local resentment grew, and when the Honduran government launched a land reform program in 1962, it allowed native landowners to reclaim territory, often at the expense of Salvadoran squatters. Tensions simmered and violence began to brew. Meanwhile, both nations struggled under fragile governments. In El Salvador, the military ruled with an iron hand, but faced increasing pressure from a restless, poor population. In Honduras, the government was weak and heavily influenced by powerful landowners. Each regime needed a distraction, a way to channel the anger of the people outward, away from their own failures. And then came the World Cup qualifiers. In 1969, the two nations faced off for a spot in the 1970 FIFA World Cup. The matchup was more than sport. It became a matter of national pride. On June 8th, the first leg took place in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. The Salvadoran players were kept awake all night by hostile crowds banging pots, throwing rocks, and shouting insults outside their hotel. When the game began, emotions were raw. Honduras won 1-0 in a brutal match that left players injured and fans furious. But the real chaos came after. Reports of Salvadoran fans and players being attacked fueled outrage back home. 1 week later, the second leg was held in San Salvador. The Honduran team, arriving in an atmosphere of vengeance, faced the same harassment, but far worse. Their bus was surrounded by mobs throwing stones and bottles. Inside the stadium, tension turned toxic. El Salvador dominated and won 3-0. But the final whistle didn't end the battle. It ignited it. Riots broke out, and several Honduran fans were beaten or killed as they tried to leave. The next morning, Honduran newspapers printed photos of the violence, calling it a national humiliation. Across the border, Salvadorans were expelled from their homes, beaten or worse. Thousands fled back to El Salvador, bringing stories of atrocities that inflamed national outrage. As both governments exchanged accusations, hatred filled the airwaves. Radio stations in El Salvador broadcast patriotic anthems, framing the crisis as an attack on Salvadoran dignity. Propaganda painted Honduras as a tyrant, expelling innocent farmers and violating human rights. Honduras responded with the same rhetoric, accusing El Salvador of aggression and lawlessness. On June 27th, after the third and final playoff match in Mexico City, which El Salvador won 3-2 after extra time, relations snapped completely. El Salvador announced it was cutting all diplomatic ties with Honduras. The football war had begun. But the spark of soccer was just a cover for years of tension. Behind the scenes, Salvadoran generals were already mobilizing troops. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched air raids and ground attacks against Honduras. The world was stunned. How could a football rivalry erupt into war in a matter of days? Yet for both sides, it was no longer about sport. It was about honor, survival, and revenge. El Salvador's Air Force struck first, targeting the Toncontín Airport in Tegucigalpa. Their small, propeller-driven planes, many converted from civilian aircraft, bombed Honduran fuel depots and communication centers. Simultaneously, Salvadoran ground troops poured across the border at multiple points, advancing toward key cities like Nueva Ocotepeque and Choluteca. At first, El Salvador's forces gained ground. They were better organized and more experienced, many having trained under U.S. military programs. But Honduras was quick to fight back. Its air force, equipped with slightly more modern planes, retaliated with bombing runs that struck deep into Salvadoran territory. Villages burned, civilians fled by the tens of thousands. International outrage grew as the death toll climbed. In just a few days, the conflict claimed thousands of lives, most of them civilians. El Salvador's initial advances stalled as supply lines stretched thin. Honduras began regaining lost ground, and as both sides bombed each other's infrastructure, the economic cost soared. Bridges, highways, and factories were destroyed, crippling both nations' fragile economies. By July 18th, 4 days after the first shots were fired, the Organization of American States stepped in. Through frantic diplomacy, they brokered a ceasefire. Under pressure from the United States and neighboring countries, El Salvador agreed to withdraw its troops on one condition. Honduras had to guarantee the safety of Salvadoran refugees, but trust was gone. It took 2 more weeks before the last Salvadoran soldiers retreated across the border. The war was over, but the wounds it left behind would take decades to heal. When the smoke cleared, the football war had lasted just 100 hours, but in that short time, around 6,000 people had died, most of them civilians. More than 100,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras were displaced, forced to return to a homeland that couldn't feed them. The borders hardened, trade collapsed, and diplomatic relations remained frozen for over a decade. Both nations descended into deeper political instability. In El Salvador, resentment and economic despair fed into a growing civil conflict that would later explode into the Salvadoran Civil War of the 1980s. In Honduras, the military gained more power, paving the way for years of dictatorship and corruption. It would take until 1980 for El Salvador and Honduras to finally sign a peace treaty. Even then, the border dispute dragged on until 1992, when the International Court of Justice finally settled the matter. By then, the football war had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of how easily pride and propaganda can turn neighbor against neighbor, and yet, calling it the football war misses the point. Yes, soccer lit the spark, but it was poverty, inequality, and nationalism that built the fire. The games merely gave both nations an excuse to unleash what they had been holding back for years. In the end, there were no victors, only loss, grief, and a haunting reminder of how fragile peace can be. Even today, the story feels surreal. A war over a soccer match? It sounds absurd until you remember that every war, no matter how irrational, starts with a story people believe in. For El Salvador and Honduras in 1969, that story was one of pride, humiliation, and revenge. The war lasted only 4 days, but its shadows stretched across generations. It taught the world that even something as beautiful as the beautiful game can, in the wrong hands, become a weapon.